Michael P. Pezzella, United States Marine Corps, Korea, the Forgotten War. Mike's one of my Marines from the Korean War. He served in Korea during the Chosin Reservoir 1950-1951 with the infantry. He was with Item Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division, who were at the Chosin Reservoir. Just a great man. Tells an amazing story of his action in Korea, and I give every one of these guys a Silver Star, Congressional Medal of Honor, Bronze Star for what they did. Just an unsung hero in my book. So I had the pleasure of meeting Mike. He was 76 years old, Abington, Maryland. It was November 30th, 2006. He died in 2016. Folks, I've lost a lot of my World War II veterans, most of the ones that I've interviewed that I know of, and now most of my Korean War veterans. It's sad to me. My work's become bittersweet, but I thank God. I'm so grateful for the stories that I've recorded over the years that I can share with you, and people around the world are watching these videos, folks. And our young people do need to hear these stories like Mike shares today, because they're our future generation. They need to know the price for freedom, and it's not being taught in the schools. So we need to share these stories with them. It should be mandatory showing, as some of you have commented in my videos. So, but God bless Mike Pezzella. I'd like to thank Brandon Glidden again for sponsoring these stories from Korea. Brandon, without you, man, we're not going to do this. So these stories are getting out there. People are learning about the Korean War because of you, Brandon. Thank you again for your service to our country and just helping me support my work. God bless you. Okay, folks, my heart's full. I say that a lot, but it is. My work's bittersweet, like I said, but I know there's going to be a great reunion in heaven someday with all these veterans, and hopefully we're all going to be there to shake their hands. Amen. Okay, folks, I'd like to encourage some of you that have been thinking about sponsoring one of these stories to do so. There's information in the video description. You click on the link, or LarryCapetto.com, my website, click on Sponsor a Vet. When you go to that page, folks, you're going to see a bunch of pictures of some of the veterans, not all of them, some of the veterans I've interviewed. Scroll down, click on a picture, see where they fought, where they served, and then include their name as you would sponsor a video. So make sure you put the name of the veteran in the comment section as you would go forth and make a donation to my work, so I'll know who you'd like to sponsor, okay? If you'd like to just donate to my work, you can do so by going to the comment section of this video and clicking on the link. So again, I don't monetize these videos, folks. No commercials here. This is sacred ground for me, man. I mean, you know, when I went to Omaha Beach, I felt like I was walking on holy ground. When I went to Iwo Jima in 2006 with Marines, I felt like I was walking on holy ground. So these stories are becoming more valuable in time. With every page of history lost, these stories become more valuable. Like I said, this isn't taught in the school. So let's keep this thing going, folks. Freedom is not free. Freedom is earned. Let's bring forth these stories so our younger generation can hear them, and our older generations can too hear them, and we'll be the better for it. Okay? Please subscribe to this channel, share these videos like I said, and I'll talk to you soon. God bless you. How old are you now, Mike?
I'm 76. I'll be 77 in 2 months, less than 2 months.
So you were with the 1st Marine Division?
Yes, I was with the Item Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division.
And what was your job? Were you, I know you're a rifleman as a Marine, but was that your job, infantry, or what?
Actually, I was trained as an engineer, but they didn't need engineers at that particular time, so I was assigned to an infantry company.
Were you drafted? Or you...
No, I had been in the Reserve, Marine Corps Reserve for 3 years prior to active duty,
Okay.
and we were sent to Korea, and I was assigned to Item Company, and at Item Company they decided to make me sort of a runner or a gopher, so to speak, for the first sergeant of the company. And I did various jobs. I was shotgun for the company Jeep driver when he went on little missions, and I also accompanied some of the patrols, and during times of activity I had my own foxhole and so forth, so I did the normal job of a rifleman. And it was quite interesting because I got to be around the headquarters quite a bit, and I saw how the company operated and how the various companies and battalions were communicated and moved on objectives and so forth. So I found it extremely interesting, and I was in an excellent position to see it.
Tell me just a brief history of Korea, why we were involved, what happened to have us involved in that campaign.
Well, the North evidently, from as a result of our foreign policy previously, and they got the impression that we would not react to any invasion of South Korea. And the North Koreans were prepared for it. They had a large military force, and they crossed the 38th parallel and very quickly moved down to the south of Korea. But when President Truman decided to take action, and through the United Nations was a primary person, or they were the primary responsibility for military activity, but it was mainly American forces at first. And they were pocketed at the very southern tip of Korea in what is called the Pusan Perimeter. And shortly after that, I was supposed to be part of the NMHOM landing. However, we were held back for some reason or another, and I didn't make the NMHOM landing, where the Marines pulled out of the line at Pusan and landed at a place where they figured that a landing would be impossible. It was very difficult, but they were fortunate enough that they made it because of the harbor situation and the very high and low tides. Had some things happened, they might have been stranded about 200 yards offshore. And fortunately, the North Koreans did not feel that this was a practical place for any possible landing, so they did not defend it that heavily. So it was very successful, and it cut off all the North Koreans who were in the peninsula south of Seoul. And we moved forward to Seoul. I was not with the company at this particular time, but I joined the company at a place called Wonsan, which is a city on the coast of North Korea. And that's where I joined my company.
And your first time in a combat situation? Is this your first time?
First time, yes.
Did you feel invincible at all? I mean, as a young Marine, or?
No, I wouldn't think I was invincible. I had confidence that the people around me knew what they were doing, and I was confident that I could help them the same way they could help me. So I was not, I certainly wouldn't consider that invincibility, but I felt quite satisfied with the situation I was in. And of course I didn't like it, and I was frightened, but I had confidence in what would happen.
Well, walk me into eventually up into the Chosin Reservoir area. You're what? July, August, September?
No, this is the very beginning of November.
Okay.
When I joined the company.
Okay, good. So
right.
take me into if where you were as you progressed into what's called the Chosin Reservoir area, and then maybe Thanksgiving, and were you
Certainly.
and this as we get into it, of course, the cold. But just start walking me into it. Are you encountering any enemy at this time?
We encountered mainly small groups who were retreating, and somewhat like, I guess you would call them, insurgents today. They were attacking groups that they felt were vulnerable, and small units and so forth. Our patrols were encountering some other enemy, however. As we moved north from the city of Wonsan, we were heading up a single main supply route toward the Chosin Reservoir. And this was unfortunate because this single road through the mountainous area was very vulnerable to attack. And our patrols went out and they saw enemy forces, but the enemy forces very often would retreat very quickly, and it was only on occasion, maybe somewhere around the second week of November, that I was talking with one of our people who had just come back from a patrol, and he said he was almost sure that these were Chinese, not North Koreans. If anything, they were not North Koreans. And as we moved north, we came to a place called Coterie, and this is where the regimental headquarters was established. And we were there for a few days, and later on we moved a little farther forward, and it was around Thanksgiving time. We were given a hot Thanksgiving meal. It was cold at this particular time, but it was not unbearable cold. It was probably in the single digits to double-digit cold, but it was not too bad, and we were equipped for that. We had heavy parkas, and of course the weaponry would work under those conditions. Just after Thanksgiving, we began moving forward, and we did encounter some small arms fire and some enemy units, which were very small. We're talking about probably less than 30 men, and we encountered those on patrol. And there was some firing, but nothing. I think we only lost one man killed and another man wounded on the way up at this particular point. And then we were told we would be moving forward to a place called the Chosin Reservoir. Actually, it's officially called the Changjin Reservoir. However, on the Marine Corps maps, which were made up by the Japanese, they called it the Chosin, so we called it the Chosin. We moved out along this single road, and it became very windy, and we were going up in altitude. And I can remember looking over the side of the truck, and that's probably the second most frightening moment in Korea, was looking over the side of the truck on this very narrow road and observing these rail cars and trains and so forth, which were smaller than the trains in a Christmas garden. They were very tiny, but looking from that distance, that's how high up we were. And at some point, actually, the wheels, the tires of the 6x, as we call them, which were the trucks, were actually over the edge of the side of the road. So it was not a great experience going up that road, and that took us almost a full day. And we arrived at a place called the Chosin Reservoir, and immediately it became very noticeable that the temperature had dropped severely. The first night at the Chosin was somewhere around November 26th or 27th, I can't recall which. And it was so extremely cold, I was on 2-hour guard duty, that I didn't think I'd make it, because it was just, the type of cold would go through your body and cause pain. It was almost like a torture being out in it. I'd never experienced anything even close to that. Found out later it was probably in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 degrees below zero. And after my watch, we did have some shelter, and we did have sleeping bags which were quilted. And I was fortunate because not everyone in the company had one of those sleeping bags. Some of them only, most of the company had at that particular time just a single blanket type sleeping bag, so they were a lot colder than I was. We did have a tent at that particular time, as I recall. They set up a tent, and I was, not for everyone, but I was lucky enough, having been connected with the headquarters unit, to be able to sleep in the tent. It was either the next night or the night after, I can't recall which, that we were sleeping in a sort of a, we had dug our foxhole. This is interesting too, I think, that we were unable to dig. The ground was so hard. Our company commander, who turned out to be a very, very smart man in combat, decided to contact the engineers, and he got blocks of the C4 explosive. And they would cut that up and put in the explosive on the ground, set it off, and that would break through the icy crust of the ground. Once that was done, we could actually shovel out the rest. So we dug our holes, which was a terrible job, but we managed to dig our foxholes, and he became very adamant that we set up a strong defensive position. Now, at the time, we had been moving along. We'd stayed in one place 2-3 nights at most, the very most, and then just moved forward. And we couldn't understand why we were going through all these machinations, or whatever you want to call them, about a strong perimeter with barbed wire, with booby traps, and all the rest. Well, come to find out, he had gotten some intelligence, and he was a World War II vet who had fought on Guadalcanal. And actually, he was a first lieutenant, but he was commanding a company because he had been, I understand, to Chesty Puller. Now, all Marines know who Chesty Puller was. He was a very famous Marine. He received something like 5 Navy Crosses, and I saw him several times. He was very typical of a Marine commander, and as a result, he made Lieutenant Bull Fisher, as we called him, Bull, he was Joseph Fisher, he made him a company commander. And just prior to going to the reservoir, another odd thing happened. He held a company inspection, and we were all shaking our heads wondering why we were being inspected, and every man had to carry a full belt of ammunition and plus some extra rounds for the M1 rifle. And we were also had to have 2 grenades, at least 2 grenades. And we also were given extra gear like mortar shells and rockets for the bazooka rocket launchers and everything. And everyone was just shaking their head, wondering what had happened to our commanding officer, that he had gone berserk or something. But at any rate, he suspected something was going to happen, even though the higher headquarters in Tokyo insisted that these were only small groups of volunteer Chinese. They admitted at this point that the Chinese were in that respect. And at any rate, we set up the fortifications, and I was with him when he set up aligned the mortars so that they would fire and the shells would land in what was the obvious paths of attack. And again, I was shaking my head, as everyone else in the company was, that what is going on here? Why are we setting up these strong defenses? Well, the next night we found out, because somewhere around, I guess it was just before midnight, I was supposed to go on watch, but at that particular point I heard some firing, and I figured, what's going on now? It was not unusual to hear firing, but the amount of it was a bit more than we had heard in the past when there were small patrol actions and guerrillas and so forth attacking our position. And we got the word, everyone 100% fall out, and I went out to my hole, which was right at the road where we had set up a roadblock. And the firing became more intense. In fact, it became very intense. And there were mortars dropping on us, but it wasn't concentrated. They were I understand, 120 millimeter mortars. It was made an awful racket. And then I saw some white phosphorus fall into our mortar position, which was just across the road. As the firing progressed, in the flashes, you could see bodies coming toward our positions. And at one point, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Fisher, jumped into my hole. And I was, felt, what is he doing here? Well, of course, I was on part of the roadblock. There were machine guns on the roadblock, and then we were the outer flank of the roadblock, and we were supposed essentially to protect the machine guns from flanking movements. And he ordered the machine guns to fire tracers into a farmhouse roof, which was a thatched roof about 500 yards out from our position. And he did, and the roof caught fire. Well, when it did, it backlighted the attacking Chinese, and to see the numbers of figures moving in the dark toward our position was a bit frightening, to say the least. And we figured, oh, here they come. Well, it provided excellent targets. This backlighting provided excellent targets for our guns, and the mortars as well. And they directed mortar fire and machine gun fire, and we even had some recoilless rifles which fired away, and the Chinese kept coming, however. And this went on for several hours, and the first sergeant came over, and he pulled me and another man out of our hole and just behind the position, and he said, "Howe Company," which was H Company of the same regiment. Going back a moment, when we were at Coterie, the regimental headquarters, Chesty Puller did not have enough transport to send all of us, the entire regiment, to the Reservoir. So he sent 2 rifle companies and a headquarters company up there. The third rifle company was held back at Coterie. But at any rate, at this particular point, Howe Company, our sister company, so to speak, in the same regiment, was on our left flank. And they were being overrun, and they were a little short on ammunition. So he grabbed this other man, myself, and he said, "Howe Company's in trouble. We need to send them, give them some ammunition." So we made a big mistake at that particular point. Instead of opening the boxes of ammo and strapping the bandoliers around us, I guess in the excitement of battle, he grabbed one end of the box and I grabbed the other, and away we went across this road. Well, we hadn't taken more than about 10 steps, and suddenly I saw these flashes in front of my eyes, coming across in front of my eyes. And at first I didn't know what was going on, but then I realized these are tracer bullets going right in front of us, and some of them, I'm sure, came between me and the man who was on the front end of this box. At that point, I dropped the box and just dropped to the ground. And the other man ran forward and jumped into a ditch on the other side of the road, but I was right in the middle of the road, and I could feel the dirt hitting my face. I'll never forget this. The dirt was hitting my face from the machine gun rounds that were hitting right around my body. And they tore up the ground quite a bit. And then suddenly I felt this shock in my leg, my left leg. And it didn't hurt. It was just like somebody had hit me with a hammer or something. And just prior to our being fired on, a star shell had gone off, which probably silhouetted us. And the star shell went out, and the firing stopped. I found out later from one of the men in the company that this Chinese machine gun had set up on a hill up to in front of us, a slight incline, and it fired down on me, and the bullet came from across my leg and sort of opened it, the skin, grooved the skin to the bone. Well, I'm lying in the middle of this road, and I heard a corpsman yell out to me, "Are you hit?" And I said, "I don't know." I thought I was, but I could move I wiggled my toes, I could move my toes, so I figured, well, maybe it was just a clump of dirt or something that hit me. And he came running out, which was not a very smart move on his part, but I got to my feet, and both of us headed to the side of the road, and he looked at my leg, and he says, "Yeah, you're hit all right." So he just wrapped it up very temporarily, and I could walk. I didn't feel pain from the wound. And we were behind this little farm building. It was partially destroyed, but we were behind that and had some shelter. And up comes an ambulance on the road. And they said, "Well, hop in the ambulance." Well, at first I refused because the ambulance was going to go a very short distance on that road from where I was hit. And I figured I'm going to be in a moving target here. And if that machine gun opens up again, at any rate, I found out later that one of our guns saw the flashes of the tracers from this enemy machine gun that was firing on me, and they opened fire on it and took it out. And the next day I was told, "That's a good thing he was firing on you because we would have never known he could have hurt somebody." Well, he hurt me. But that seemed to be a joke, at any rate.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions here. You've gone up in elevation. It's cold. The elements obviously are an enemy to you as well as the Chinese. I mean, what other type of combat did you experience yourself? Did you have an M1?
The M1 rifle that was the time before I was hit. Mm-hmm. Now, later on, I was given a captured enemy weapon, which I carried with me, and it was a Thompson submachine gun.
Sure.
They had a great many American-type weapons because they had gotten them from the nationalist Chinese, I understand. So I did carry a Thompson for a while. But probably the most interesting story is when I was taken back to the aid station. The aid station was only about 50 yards behind the very spot where I was hit. And because the ambulance no sooner pulled off than it stopped, and out we got, and it was rather crowded with wounded. It was a one or two room Korean schoolhouse, and the people coming in were in one room, and the wounded were in one room, and the operating tables were set up in the next room. And there was a glass partition between them, or it may have been open, but I could see very clearly into the operating room, and there were 3 surgeons working on them in there, and there were bullets coming through the ceiling. And I noticed those bullets were not coming more than, they were coming as close as probably 6 inches above the head of these doctors. They did not hesitate. It was one of the bravest things I've ever seen. And they just kept on operating as if nothing were happening. And they had some racks, and they had about 2 high, and the wounded on the top of those racks who weren't ambulatory were yelling, "Get me down from here, get me down from here," because the bullets were passing just above them. At one point during the night, incidentally, they redressed my wound and wrapped it in a blanket, and they said, "You can go back tomorrow morning and just come back each day to get this taken care of until we get out of here." Shortly after that, I was they found out they knew I was ambulatory and I wasn't complaining about being hurt or anything. So they said, "Do you still have your rifle?" I said, "Yes." So they said, "Cover that door and shoot anybody who comes through it." And I sat there, and what I didn't know was that the Chinese who had broken through Howe Company, there was only a handful of them, that one of them come up to the window of this aid station and stuck in his burp gun in the window, and a corpsman shot him just before he pulled the trigger. Otherwise, he'd have sprayed the room with bullets. So they figured anyone coming in that particular door would be Chinese. Well, it was the most frightening night of my life, naturally. And the next morning, I got the okay to go back to my company during the day. And I did this for about 4 or 5 days. We were attacked the next night, but it was not a vicious attack. It was only, we had weakened the enemy considerably. They counted somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 dead in front of our company front. And it evidently hurt the Chinese considerably because they were never able to mount a strong attack on us from that point on. Later on, they combined their forces and tried to get in through the back door of the town of Hagaroo-Ri, where we were located. And at one point during the battle, I looked over my shoulder and I saw these men working I could see them in the distance on bulldozers. And they had their lights on and everything. They were trying to complete an airfield, which was absolutely vital. And they, with Chinese attacking everything, they just kept on bulldozing away. Now they were probably, maybe 1,000 yards behind us, but still they were within range of the Chinese weapons. And again, this is an extremely courageous thing, and I'll never forget it. The next morning we got airdrops, or next morning, I'm not sure how many days it was. It may have been 1-2 days later, they completed that airstrip and overcame the planes, and they dropped by parachute supplies and everything, and then they came in and landed at the airfield and began carrying off wounded. Well, somewhere about, I guess it was 4, maybe 5 days later, I was going back to the aid station to get my wound readjusted, and the doctor said, I want you on that plane. He says, go out to the airfield. Well, I tried to make some sort of argument that my company needed me and I wasn't hurt that bad and all the rest of that. But he got very adamant and he ordered me to the airfield, so I went. And I got on a plane and was transported. We flew, one of the planes ahead of us was crashed at the end of the runway. It was fired on and it crashed. And so they told us to be prepared because there may be enemy fire coming through at the plane. And again, this was a very nervous experience, but we made it, and we flew down to an Army hospital which was set up on the coast. And I was there for about 2 days, 3 days, no, 2 days probably. And the men started coming out. They had fought their way out of the reservoir through the Chinese blockades, and were coming out to the coast. And we were ordered, excuse me, out of the hospital and to get on the convoy. Well, I got out to the convoy with another man that I'd become acquainted with because he was in the bunk next to me in the hospital. And I realized that I'd left my field jacket inside with 2 grenades in the pocket. They had a fire and they were throwing things in, clothing and all sorts of things on this fire. It was a big bonfire. And I figured somebody throws those grenades in there, they're going to go off and somebody's going to get hurt. So I said, I got to go back and get my jacket. Well, he came with me, and when we came back, the convoy was gone. But there were still plenty of men around. And I saw an officer, so I asked him, I told him what happened. He said, well, wait, there'll be another convoy. It'll take you down to the docks. Well, it did. It came along, and we went down to the docks, and we boarded a ship, and they were boarded a landing craft, and they were taking us out to a ship, the hospital ship. But at that particular point, the hospital ship had so many wounded aboard, they were only taking stretcher cases. Anybody who was ambulatory was put aboard another ship, and from there we went to Japan. And
Now, did you get frostbite at the Chosin?
I got frostbite in the hands and feet. My feet were frostbitten. I didn't realize it until later in life when I started having problems with my feet. I just thought these were natural problems. You know, maybe my shoes, I'd worn a large size most of my life, and it was very difficult to buy, in those days, to get size 13E or something like that. So I thought maybe it was a result of wearing shoes that didn't fit properly. But in 1995, I attended a reunion in Portland, Oregon, and they had 3 doctors there who were experts in frostbite. And they put me on a machine called an infrared spectrometer. And they showed me the pictures. At the end of my toes, it was all black. They listened to my story first, and my problems with my feet. And they said, there it is, you have frostbite, there's no question about it. A few years later, I started getting complete numbness in my fingertips and this little pain and so forth. And the VA determined that I did have loss of sensitivity and so forth. They said it was due to the frostbite.
Were any of your friends wounded or killed at the Chosin Reservoir?
Oh yes, yes.
Give me a couple of stories of, were you with them, or I mean?
No, I was with. I was the only one that, in my group that had trained and come over. Well, there were several that had come over on the ship, but there was no one that I knew as a close friend. There were about 4 people who were killed there that I had known in the reserve battalion. Later on, I lost a very close friend in May of that year, of the next year, 51, and also my platoon sergeant in the reserves was lost at that particular time, and those 2 were men that I knew quite intimately, and the one fellow I'd almost grown up with. So, as I say, we lost a lot of men at the reservoir, but I guess I was fortunate that I was not close to any of them at that particular time. The 4 men from my battalion were in other units, so that I wasn't near them. I didn't find out about their deaths until a little later.
Tell me just a little bit more about the combat you experienced. I mean, you were there a number of days. Tell me a little bit more about the enemy and the combat, and did you get within firing distance? I mean, how did you?
Oh yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the combat at the Chosin Reservoir.
Well, they would attack in groups, and you would see as I said, the flashes or the back lighting. You'd see the groups of 5, 6, 7 men coming toward you. And of course you're firing away, and you really couldn't tell much whether you were hitting anything or not, because it seemed like whatever you were firing at, they'd either hit the ground or something, or things were moving around too quickly to really determine. However, it was obvious the next morning that we had killed quite a few of them. I walked along the line the next morning after I'd been wounded and came back to my company. I walked along our perimeter, and there were Chinese dead all over around the foxholes. I mean, in fact, some of them rather crudely set the Chinese bodies, which were all stiff. They did not look like human bodies. They looked like wax figures at that point. They were all frozen stiff. And they'd set them around the foxholes for protection, which is called Chinese sandbags, which is not a very nice thing, but at that particular point, I came across one fella, and I looked in his foxhole. At the end of his foxhole was the man in a Chinese uniform, had no face. His entire front of his face was gone. I said, what happened to this guy? He said, well, he jumped in the hole with me, and I thought it was another Marine. And he said, we're snuggled together, sort of, and a flare goes off, and I look at him, and I see the slant eyes. He said, and I got startled. I went back, and when I went back, my entrenching tool was there, and I grabbed that, and I just kept beating on him, which is a pretty horrible story, but there were a lot of horrible things that went on there. And it was no question that some of them had actually gotten behind our foxholes before they were killed. But as I said, they would come in and they would throw these what they call potato mashers, which are their type of grenades, like a ball on the end of a stick. But they were having the problem with the cold as well as we were. The things weren't going off, and they were all over the ground in front of our foxholes. And had they worked, there's no question that they might have broken through in more points than just that one in our company and one in the Howe company on our left. I think the Chinese that had broken through sort of during the day, you didn't know that they were there, then they would come up at night. But this one day, I was called back after I'd gotten my leg dressed. I went and they said they had some hot chow in this one tent that they had set up. And they were making pancakes, which were kind of ridiculous because they'd put them on your steel tray, and by the time you got to eat them, it was like eating toast. You know, it was crunchy, they were cold. Well, we had to get in a line to sure they had a fire and a bucket of water where you dumped your tray in and then pulled it out and put it on a pile of frozen trays with water frozen on them. And a guy about 4 or 5 up from me puts his tray in there. He heard this clunk. And he pulls his tray out and there's a hole in it. And there was some Chinese out there in one of the rice paddies decided he was going to kill somebody. But he hit the tray. Well, next thing you know, we all scattered and they formed a group, which I was not one of, but they went after this Chinese and they finally got him. But
Were you a machine gunner?
no, I was a rifleman, and then I got the Thompson submachine gun, which I used.
You're a private?
I was a corporal at the time.
So are you in charge of a squad or anything?
No, as I said, I was sort of a company runner and the gopher for the first sergeant. Whenever he needed something, he'd send me for it, or I was running around between the various company units, platoons, and so forth.
So what's the goal of the Marines? Are you going up to the top of the reservoir trying to drive the Chinese back, or did they drive you back down?
Well, at that particular point, we just were trying to maintain a perimeter around this airstrip and this town called Hagaroo-Ree. And because it was absolutely essential, we were sort of in a midpoint. Hagaroo-Ree was at the very foot of the reservoir. One of our regiments, the 5th Marines, had gone up one side, and the 7th Marines had gone up the other, and they were like a prongs ahead of us. They were all cut off. And the people at Coterie behind us, several miles behind us, down the bottom of the hill, this road going down, I guess it was something in the neighborhood, I think 17, 20 miles, something like that. They were cut off, and the Chinese were in very heavy numbers between us and the way out, so to speak. Well, the plan was, and it's the only possible plan, was the 2 Marine regiments would fight their way back to Hagaroo-Ree, where there was an airfield. The wounded could be evacuated, and of course the supplies were being brought in there. So our job was to maintain that perimeter against the Chinese so that they could not break in. And as I said, after the first 2 attacks, the first attack, the Chinese were so badly beaten, they never were able to mount a second attack. One of the reasons that they weren't also is not only the number that we were able to kill and wound the night before, but as soon as daylight broke, we could hear the roar of engines coming right over our positions. And here came the Marine Corps Corsairs. That's the gull-wing fighter planes, F-4Us, and with guns firing. In fact, we had several times sort of huddled in that we hoped we wouldn't get hit with the shell cases from the guns that were firing from the planes. And they caught the Chinese in an exposed position before they could get to the hills and get cover. And with napalm and machine guns, they just destroyed the Chinese attack, so to speak, what was left of it the next morning.
But what was our goal? Is you just...
Well, the goal...
But we went up to the top, didn't we? We got overrun?
Yes, but see, our goal was the Yalu River. And once we got to the Chosin Reservoir, as I said, the units split, and the Chinese, who were not supposed to be there, it's proved to be something like 120,000 Chinese, slipped in behind us and around us and cut us off. They also, the Army, which was on the left flank, they were surrounded too, particularly the 31st and 32nd Regiments. 31st took terrible casualties, 31st Army Regiment of the 7th Army Division. They took terrible casualties. In fact, some of their survivors made it through our lines, and I'll never forget seeing those guys come in. We realized they were friendly. We let them into our perimeter and tried to take care of them. They were frozen, and this one sergeant is a strapping young man. Both his legs from the knees on down were black. And I figured, oh my God, this guy's going to be an amputee. And it was just heart-wrenching to see some of these men. But at any rate.
Well, the Army was overrun. They were wiped out.
Well, the 31st Regiment took the hardest hit. It's also, in one of the books that was written by an Army officer, I understand, he says that the Marine Corps Marine Corps 1st Division was sort of saved by their sacrifice. And it's quite possible. I don't deny that he probably hit the Chinese, or they in being overrun and everything, they hurt the Chinese rather badly so that the Chinese could not concentrate their entire force on us. I think the Chinese made some, from what I understand, they made some strategic errors by not combining their forces and striking one target at a time, because they came so close to overrunning us that had they been, all the Chinese Army units, there were 7 divisions I think, been concentrated on us, there's no way we would have gotten out of there. No way at all.
So did we win the Chosin Reservoir campaign? Or?
Well, you can't say it was a win because that stopped the northern movement of Americans, and we had to flee to the south, so to speak, but we didn't flee, we had to fight our way out. So as our commanding officer, General O.P. Smith, said, so this is not a retreat, we're just attacking in a different direction. And he was right, because between us and the sea were something like 22 heavily armed Chinese roadblocks. I was fortunate in the fact that I got flown out, but the rest of the guys had to fight their way out. And they went through every one of these roadblocks one by one and finally made it to the sea, opened the road and made it out of there.
But it wasn't like a defeat. It was like a regrouping, maybe?
I don't think you can call it entirely a defeat. You'd have to consider the fact that they were so overwhelmed, or we were so overwhelmed by a force that was almost 10 times our number, and we had to retreat from that force or fight our way out of it. I guess you would call that, in some ways, it was a defeat, because we could not progress northward to our objective, which was the Yalu River. But I don't think it was a defeat.
Why didn't the intelligence tell us that all those Chinese were there?
There are some different stories about that, and it's a sore point as far as I'm concerned, because a story that I've heard, and it seems to be true, was that MacArthur had said earlier that the Chinese would never enter the Korean conflict. When we start sending them reports that we were encountering Chinese, I understand that they were withheld from General MacArthur because no one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. And I'm told that they have what they call a battle map or battle plan or something, order of battle. And on one day there are no Chinese listed, and on the next day there's 120,000 listed that they realized were there. You know, they had to admit they were there because there were so many units, our units, not only 1st Division, but the 7th Army Division, and on the West Coast, the 2nd Army Division, and all the Army units to the west of us were all either encountering very heavy opposition or else were being surrounded by the Chinese.
Were these young men or old men? Did you see these Chinese? And also, were we better warriors than them?
It's hard to determine whether we were better than them. They showed a great deal of courage, whatever I'll say, but they did not have the weaponry we had. The Chinese in front of my foxhole had Mauser rifles. These are bolt-action rifles, and a few of them had burp guns. The automatic weapons were, well, a few burp guns, but also the automatic weapons for the most part were captured American Thompson submachine guns. And there weren't too many of those around. As I said, and they had all sorts of rifles. They were Mausers, some of them even had American O3s, and that Springfield O3 rifle, which is a bolt-action rifle. And I understand Czechoslovakian, you name it, but it must have been a tremendous job for their supply sergeant to provide them with ammunition for all these things. And I'm told, I don't know how true this is that the forward ranks would carry the weapons, and they had so much need of weapons that very often the men in the following ranks would not have a weapon. They would pick up their weapons from the ones that had fallen before them. I've heard that story. I can't testify that it's true, but they could not put up the firepower that we had. Their machine guns were usually captured American machine guns, not captured, captured from the nationalist Chinese. We had supplied the nationalist army under Chiang Kai-shek with a lot of weapons, and the communists picked them up from the nationalists.
Mike, do you think about the Korean War today? I mean, does it have any significance in your life?
Very much so. At the present time, only until the end of December, I've been for the last 3 years on the board of directors of the Chosin Few Incorporated, which is an international organization of Marines, Army, Koreans, and also the British Marines who were involved in there. And we're very indebted to the RMs, as we call them, the 41st, 41 is the way they designate it, the 41 Independent Commando. And these guys were just absolutely fantastic. They refuse to wear helmets. They wore their green berets. I tried to buy one from him. He wouldn't sell it for any price. And I've been to several of their reunions, and they're just great. And a close friend of mine, who was a Royal Marine, we became very close. He just died recently, unfortunately, but we would sort of reminisce together and some of the things that had happened. And well, it's just, we have, the Chosin Few has reunions every 2 years. And our last one was in Las Vegas.
I'm going to talk to you about that just a minute off camera real quick, but we're getting to the end of the interview, and I know you got to go soon, so let me wrap this up. But being a veteran of Korea and an American citizen, what does freedom mean to you? And tell me about the price of freedom.
Well, I think we in Korea. However, I think it was fortunate that we did oppose the communist expansion there, because that started something that unfortunately in Vietnam I think we goofed, but we might have won. But at any rate, the stopping of the Chinese or the communism in Korea was extremely important. Had we allowed them to continue forward, I think Japan would have been their next target. Then we would have been in deep trouble, I think. And I think we did the right thing, because when I see Korea today and the Korean people, I'm just very proud of their accomplishments, and I feel like I had a part of it. And I was invited to a Korean group recently, and I gave a very short speech in which I told them that I'm proud of them, because they have become, those who have come to America have become very good, and they've made it very profitable for themselves, but they've made life better for all Americans because of what they've contributed to our society. And I truly feel that. I think the Koreans have done an excellent job in this country.
What does the American flag mean and represent to you?
Well, it's a symbol, and it's a very touching symbol when you think of the number of people who have died to keep it flying. I think it's a tremendous respect for the flag. I get very upset when I see things like the flag burnings and so forth. I just can't understand. There are protests. There are things that are wrong with our systems, no question about it. However, I still believe that we have the greatest country, and we enjoy the greatest freedom of any country on the face of this earth. So,
Once a Marine, always a Marine?
no question about it. Something has been put into our brains, whether it's a computer chip or whatever. You never quite lose it. And I'm a member of a number of Marine organizations today. As I said, the Chosin Few, the Marine Corps League, my company unit, Item Company. I was also stationed at 8th and I Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a member of that group, alumni of that group. And the 11th Engineer Battalion in Baltimore's Own, they used to call them, the reserve unit that I was a member of. And I'm the 1st Division Association. So I belong to a few Marine Corps organizations, and as I said, I've been active in the Chosen Few, and I've been active in the other organizations as well. And I enjoy getting together with these guys. We're all sort of buddies.
One more question. What should we remember about Korea?
I think we should remember the sacrifice that something in the neighborhood of 38,000 men made to free Korea and to keep the enemy from our shores. And I do believe that Korea was instrumental in demonstrating to the communists that they could not go anywhere without opposition. They had taken over Eastern Europe, and for the main part had not been opposed militarily, certainly, but I think Korea showed that we were ready to fight, and that was important.
I'm going to ask you to do one more thing from where you're seated. I understand the protocol of a salute, but for the camera's sake, could I ask you to give me a salute into the camera when I tell you to?
Certainly. You have to know that Marines are not supposed to salute without a cover.
And sitting down. I'm not going to.
And sitting down, right.
When you see my films, you'll understand, and it's very
Okay.
respectfully done. But just whenever you're ready, give me a salute into the camera. Great. Okay.